So this then takes us to Grizzly Man, Herzog's documentary film about Timothy Treadwell, the environmentalist and bear enthusiast, nature enthusiast, but in particular bear enthusiast, who died in Alaska in the early 2000s at the hands of and mouths, I suppose, of the bears, the bears that he so loved. And of course, Timothy Treadwell shot hundreds of hours of footage in his various trips up to the Alaskan wilds where he would encounter the bears. And he made many, video diaries. And this is, of course, the sort of source footage that Herzog, the main footage that Herzog worked with when he constructed Grizzly Man, along with, of course, his own interviews and voiceover and so forth. And so I've entitled this, again, building on my argument related to Lessons of Darkness, The Contradictions of Herzog. And Matthew Gandy makes a good point, I think, in this regard when he writes that, quote, for Herzog, the reemergence of the documentary as a powerful cinematic presence is also related to a growing saturation with virtual realities so that audiences are eager to experience films in which they can, quote, this is Herzog, trust their eyes again, unquote. Yet Herzog's relationship with his audience is both awkward and attenuated. He seeks to dominate possible interpretations of his work and simultaneously liberate the viewer through various forms of aesthetic didacticism. So, in part, what Gandy is getting at here is that Herzog himself seems to, on the one hand, say his films are breaking from traditional conventions, from the nightly news, from the cliches of traditional fiction films, from the facts of cinema verite and so forth, in order to get us closer to the world in another way. At the same time, that Herzog's work, in Gandy's words, also dominates the ways that we can interpret the footage through things like Herzog's own voiceover, through his writings about the work, through his own aestheticizations. He is also just giving us his point of view. So are we actually, in fact, having this sublime experience of something that is formless, that we can encounter, that will generate our own imaginations and so forth, our own sense of mastery, perhaps even, in this complicated dialectic of the sublime? Or are we, in fact, just getting Herzog's own point of view, in contrary to his attempt to, quote, help us to trust our eyes again? This is the kind of tension that we're exploring in both Lessons of Darkness as well as Grizzly Man. And so this takes us to a further quote from Gandy, in which he writes, by anthropomorphizing the bears, Timothy Treadwell began to believe that he was safe among them, needing only to show strength on occasion to maintain his peaceful interaction. For Herzog, however, Treadwell fatally misread nature, projecting his own fantasies of ecological companionship onto an alien realm of raw survival. In all the faces of the bears Treadwell filmed, remarks Herzog, I can see no kinship, no understanding, no mercy. I see only the overwhelming indifference of nature. This blank stare speaks only of a half-bored interest in food. So we hear, in Herzog's language here about, no mercy, the overwhelming indifference of nature, and so forth. We have this going all the way back to Herzog's 1982 comments from The Burden of Dreams, right, that I mentioned in our previous half of this lecture, in which he sees nature, right, again, as something profoundly indifferent to human designs. But this can precisely be this experience of the sublime, as it were, that then again sort of reaffirms the human subject. And what Gandy is saying in terms of his reading of Herzog's understanding of Treadwell, right, is that Treadwell seems to want to forget, or seems to somehow think he's transcended this indifferent nature and has anthropomorphized it in the form of these bears, and thinks he is, deeply communicating with them. Whereas Herzog thinks this is not only unethical, but also incredibly narcissistic. Right. So this is why I've sort of, to provoke some further reflection for us, we can perhaps think about how, in Herzog's view, perhaps Timothy Treadwell is confusing something that would have been a sublime experience of the formless, right, and ultimately unknowable, of mystifying, the bears of nature, of the cosmic universe, and so forth, right, expanding outward. He's kind of confused the sublime with something beautiful, right? Um, the beautiful being something that is communicative, manageable, pleasing, and so forth, and how Treadwell, in his narcissism and his anthropomorphization of the bears, right, seems to have reduced them perhaps to something of the beautiful. And if aesthetically, right, in looking at the paintings of someone like Caspar David Friedrich, if the sublime has as one of its perhaps more readily identifiable aesthetic traits the um, wide shot of an expansive landscape that dominates small the tiny human subject, as we saw in a number of examples previously, the close-up might be one of the forms that um, the aesthetic forms that in some ways syncs up with the beautiful. And this is not a hard and fast set of pairing. This is not a hard and fast rule, but we can perhaps it can spark for us further conversation about the forms of the the aesthetic forms that complement the sublime on the one hand and the beautiful on the other. Okay, so moving on quickly, I just want to go with a couple of other Gandhi quotes. He takes us into what he calls quote, a desire in Treadwell to leave the confinements of his humanness and bond with the bears. This is Herzog. Treadwell reached out seeking a primordial encounter, but in doing so, he crossed an invisible borderline. That's Herzog. Gandhi writes, for Herzog, there was a tragic inevitability to the Treadwell story, right? Again, this inevitability, the inevitability of the end of the universe, the inevitability of the end of the world in Lessons of Darkness. And here Gandhi is getting at the tragic inevitability of the Treadwell story, a death foretold through his delusional attachment to a conception of nature that does not exist. In many ways, Treadwell is the classic Herzogian figure, making a futile gesture in the face of immense adversity, yet at the same time, Treadwell emerges as something of an anti-hero, a deluded and paranoid opponent of a narcissistic modern culture, to which he is nonetheless integrally related. So part of the tragedy of Treadwell, I think, in Herzog's view, is that the more Treadwell tried to escape from what he saw as the corruption of civilization of the modern world, the more he was in fact an expression of it when he went out into the natural world and thought he was communing with it. He was in fact all the more a modern subject. Which takes us finally to and returns us to the romantic hero. And Gandhi has something I think important to say about this when he writes that, quote, Herzog is interested in extreme landscapes that test his cinematic protagonists to their limits. These adventures, however, are invariably half-crazed Caucasian men. Landscape becomes a masculinist metaphor for courage, endurance, and self-realization. Mountains to be climbed, forests to be penetrated, and icy wastes to be traversed. Women are almost completely absent from Herzog's cinema. It is not without irony that Amy Huguenard is the invisible partner of Treadwell, also killed, and yet little more than a ghostly presence within Grizzly Man. Right? So in this sort of neo-romantic quest for the sublime and for sublime experience and for these kind of tragic figures that Herzog is drawn to, he seems to, in many ways, in a lot of cases, women don't figure into his representations. In fact, they might be the structural exclusion upon which the romantic hero can precisely be what he is, this sort of solitary figure. There has to be this necessary exclusion, this structuring absence, as it were, and that structuring absence is the feminine, right? And in Gandhi's view, and perhaps we can think about this further, in Gandhi's view, one of the near structuring absences of the film is the other person who tragically died with Timothy Treadwell, which was, of course, Amy Huguenard, who, as Gandhi says, is a ghostly, haunting presence in the film. And we know that the traditional masculinist notion of the wandering hero, in many ways, is one who needs to escape from, amongst other things, is escaping from home. Right, the sort of trappings of the mundane, the everyday, the ordinary, in order to enter the smoky expanses, the cosmic expanses of the world, in order to have these sublime, ecstatic experiences. And one of the figures that, of course, is mostly associated with home is, of course, woman, and in particular, perhaps the mother or the wife, for example. mother being perhaps key here. And yet, of course, for this romantic hero, the strange, perhaps, paradox of all of this and the irony of it is, of course, what is ultimately unfathomable in this kind of the representational universe of the, um, you know, wandering lone male heroic figure is, of course, the mystery of woman. And of course, in many ways, the landscape is feminized in order to to escape from the sort of domesticity of mother and entering out into the mysteries of the world. The world itself is something to be penetrated, right, and is something that actually, in many ways, comes to acquire in a sort of heteronormative conception of the romantic hero, comes to acquire many of the representational attributes in the imaginary of the romantic hero of womanhood. So this is the sort of interesting contradiction here we can think about. Okay, so further questions and discussion. The first thing I'd like for us to further consider is to consider the relationship between the documentary, its various ways of constructing an argument or telling a story, its aesthetics, its forms, and so forth, and the representation of the natural world. So we could discuss one of the films we have watched in class in terms of its representation of the natural environment, and further, how are animals represented in the film that we have chosen. In your discussion, you could also pay attention to the presence or absence or structuring absence of the filmmaker in how the landscape, as well as space and place, is portrayed. Second, we could discuss Werner Herzog's critique of cinema verite as what he calls the truth of accountants, in light of his image, his own self-image as a neo-romantic hero in the postmodern world. In your discussion, consider how Herzog claims to want to bring his audience closer to the world, described in terms of ecstatic truth, while at the same time he asserts his own authorship and personality in his films. Third, Lessons of Darkness uses observational footage filmed by land and air, as well as interviews shot in the aftermath of the first Gulf War in 1991 to construct a romantic vision of an alien world. How does Herzog aesthetically position Lessons of Darkness in relationship to the truth claims of the classical documentary, such as cinema verite? What is the role of voiceover narration in the film? Of course, Herzog himself is narrating it. Can we consider this a kind of performance on the part of Herzog? And finally, how does music aid Herzog in his quest to transform a historical event into the ecstatic truth of the sublime? Some of the key musical sequences in the film, Lessons of Darkness, are of course taken from Richard Wagner, amongst others. And finally, question 4. In Grizzly Man, Herzog seems to have found another romantic hero in the tragic figure of Timothy Treadwell. At the same time, Herzog is critical of what he considers Treadwell's idealized and narcissistic vision of nature. What is the role of found footage in Grizzly Man, especially in terms of Herzog's self-proclaimed quest for ecstatic truth? So I look forward to discussing these questions with you in our meeting later today, as well as online at Canvas. Thank you.